there's a little bit of a delay on live stream.
All right. All right, we're going to start in about 30 seconds. Everybody can regroup. All right. Well, welcome to the School of Nursing and to the event today on moral resiliency for moral leadership. Hi, I'm Pam Jeffries, Dean and Professor at the School of Nursing, and we're so glad you're here in our building. We want you to come more, so please, you're always invited. But I'm delighted today that the School of Nursing is hosting this panel on moral resilience for moral leadership, featuring Dr. Cynda Rushton, an international leader in bioethics in nursing. She's the Ann and George L. Bunting Professor of Clinical Ethics at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing and the Berman Institute of Bioethics. And just it's not a secret, but we're colleagues. We worked at Hopkins together from 2009 to 2015, so I'm happy to introduce Cynda as a friend, colleague, and professional. She also co-chairs Johns Hopkins Hospital's Ethics Committee and Consultation Service. A founding member of the Berman Institute, Dr. Rushton has led summits and initiatives centered around taking action to respond to nursing burnout, moral distress, and low levels of professional well-being across the healthcare field. She's also created the Rushton Moral Resilience Scale. She's joined today by the Vanderbilt University Respondents, who's Dr. Keith Meador, Director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society, Dr. Ashmeet, Oberoi, Assistant Professor of the Practice of Human and Organizational Development, and Dean of Public Interest Law, Beth, Cruz. Our panel is co-hosted by Cal Turner Program for Moral Leadership in the Professions, a co-curricular program based at Vanderbilt Divinity School, which works with Vanderbilt's professional school communities and others in Middle Tennessee to help leaders of high potential recognize and achieve the moral purpose of their work. Today's panel is funded by the Sesquicentennial Grant out of the Chancellor's Office. Again, thank you for coming, and I'll just say I'm going to have to slip out in 30 minutes because I got to go to Kirkland Hall for another meeting. So it's nothing to do with the presentation. I just have a conflict. But I am glad to be here and welcome everybody. And without further ado, Dr. Cynda Rushton.
So good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, actually back at Vanderbilt. My daughter actually went to school here, so I'm somewhat familiar with Vanderbilt in that way as well. I bring you greetings from the Dome at Johns Hopkins. It is springtime. We are beginning to see evidence of hope for new growth. And what I wanted to do to really begin is to pause. We are all in a sort of state of overstimulation most days. And I think one of the elements of the work that we're going to talk about today is really finding our way back home to why we're here. And to remember why we're doing the work that we're doing, whatever it is, whether you're a nurse or a physician or a chaplain or attorney or fill in the blank, whatever your role is. We've all been through a lot in the last 4 years. And I think we've had very few opportunities to actually take stock of how we are now. We are different. We are not the same. And yet, we have huge challenges in front of us. And so this topic couldn't be better timed, because I think it really is a time for us to really remember why we're doing this work, why it matters, and what our role might be in bringing about a new reality. So I'm going to be talking a bit about our work, looking at moral resilience and ethical practice. I'm not going to give a data talk today. This is more of a conceptual invitation to consider what it means to be whole in the midst of all the challenges that we're in. So when we think about our work, I want to just situate the conversation about moral resilience in the context of thinking about how we respond to moral adversity. And there's a lot of moral adversity out there. It is, the situations that produce discomfort, either because of internal or external circumstances, that produce morally troublesome or objectionable outcomes. And that stimulus is what we respond to. So when we think about that, there are a whole variety of responses, and Keith and I were just talking about this. I started this work a long time ago, and at the time when I was a pediatric critical care nurse, experiencing what I now know to be moral suffering, I didn't have a name for it. And so when you think about how we have evolved in just trying to describe the nature of our suffering, we have, in our work, begun to think about it in context of a continuum. That there's moral adversity, it's unavoidable as a human. You're probably not going to be able to avoid some kind of moral adversity. And initially, that may show up as moral stress. The idea that you have perceived that there is a violation or threat or potential threat to our core values. And so that moral stress is an alerting mechanism. If you think about our nervous system, our nervous system is constantly scanning for threats. Those threats can also be moral threats, threats that involve our values. And so that moral stress is necessary to say, pay attention, do something perhaps, or not. As that moral stress begins to intensify, it can be relieved. We may be able to address the issue. We may be able to find resources to really reduce the stress. But what we see a lot of is a progression to moral distress. And moral distress, I was just telling Keith, I heard recently, now has 32 definitions. So the one I'm going to share may not be your favorite. So if that's the case, I think what moral distress really, in the very beginning, when Andy Jameton in 1983 began to coin the term moral distress, it was about recognizing situations where we have recognized there's a moral problem. We have some responsibility to do something about that. And we reason and deliberate about what we think we ought to do, but either because of internal or external constraints, we can't do what we think is right. And that is the most common and most researched type of moral suffering. But what it points to is really those kinds of persistent threats to our values, to our sense of being whole. Increasingly, we have added to that continuum the concept of moral injury, which has initially been described in the military as, I would say, a more corrosive form of moral suffering that really begins to erode our sense of who we are as a person. It often involves betrayals, sometimes self-betrayal, but often betrayals by others who have power and leadership, who in the end produce the kinds of moral residue and moral suffering that I would call a soul wound. That sense of, I don't know who I am anymore. And I certainly have heard those comments from my clinician colleagues during COVID. I don't know who I am anymore. Because I have participated, I have witnessed, I have perhaps caused harm to others. So in that continuum, we can also expect that if those types of moral suffering are not relieved, it can produce moral decline, which can be either a temporary or permanent state of moral disconnection, of apathy, of outrage, and of moral disengagement. So that's kind of the context for what I'm going to talk about today. In that context, it's important for us to situate integrity in our work as the core. Moral resilience is the means to support that sense of wholeness and integrity but it has to be surrounded by a culture of ethical practice. So it's all three of those dimensions. It is not just one, it is all of them, and all of them are necessary for wholeness. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama has often said, when we meet real tragedy in life, we can react in one of two ways. Either by losing hope and falling into self-destructive habits, or using the challenge to find our inner strength. And that really was the impetus behind the pivot I made after spending many, many years focusing on the suffering side of this equation to say, okay, well, what else is possible? Are we just going to be in this well of suffering forever? Well, the answer is probably yes and no. But when we thought about our work, we really thought about it in a social ecological framework, which is about actually seeing ourselves as fundamentally interconnected. The individual, our teams, our schools, our organizations, community, society, that all of these factors are at play as we think about moral adversity and how we're going to respond to it. So back in 2015, I had the privilege of having a fellowship, visiting scholar at the Brochet Institute in Geneva. And I went there thinking I was writing a proposal on moral stress. That's what I'd been doing. And I found myself resisting. I was like, okay, well, this is simple. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I should be able to finish this. But I couldn't finish it. And so it led me into asking the question, and what else is possible? So that began this whole inquiry into moral resilience. I actually saw this phrase in an article that was written by Kim Lutzen, who's a nurse researcher, and it was built on Viktor Frankl's work. And we began to explore this concept, and this is our current definition. In a capacity of an individual to preserve or restore their integrity in response to moral adversity. And what I want to kind of specify here is putting together moral and resilience is intentional, because moral really focuses on those human aspects of our humanity. It acknowledges that moral complexity of all the decisions that we make, the competing obligations and commitments that we have in our relationships, and the inevitable ethical and moral challenges that are part of being a human. And many of those ignite our sense of conscience. They often produce confusion, sometimes conflict, and it can result in moral suffering in that sort of continuum that I talked about. But I think it's important when we think about the moral domain of what is the grounding of that, and that for us is integrity. The other side of moral resilience is the resilience part. And some of you probably are aware there's a lot of backlash about resilience these days. Very interesting. How do you think we all got here? Being born is an act of resilience. Being a human, it presumes that we have experienced some kind of adversity in our lives. And the way that we understand resilience goes way beyond this very impoverished notion of resilience as bouncing back. We don't ever really bounce back. We can only take the experience and potentially use it for growth, for learning, and to transform that adversity. So there's nothing wrong with resilience. It's the way that it's been used. And so the way that we approach it is we see resilience as an inherent state. It is more expansive in scope than often is defined as resilience. It can be amplified, it can be degraded, but I would argue cannot be extinguished. James Baldwin says Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And so moral resilience is really about not turning away, but turning toward the hard things. And being able to meet them with clear eyes, with purpose, with courage. And when we approach this whole territory of moral suffering from the point of view of turning toward, it takes us to a practice that I have often associated with our work in moral resilience. It's the practice of kintsugi. So in Japan, when a piece of pottery is broken, instead of throwing away all the shards of the pottery, they are taken back together with golden paint and cement to create a new vessel. It is not throwing it away and saying it's useless, but saying this is now incorporated into a stronger, perhaps more beautiful vessel that incorporates that experience into who we are now. And for me, this is really the essence of moral resilience. I want to say a word about what moral resilience is not. Because some people have interpreted it as, oh, it's just being complacent, looking the other way. Quite the contrary. It is not just putting a positive spin on unethical behaviors or practices, nor is it an attempt to extinguish moral suffering. Some people have proposed, well, we should just get rid of moral suffering. I would say we will not be able to be in integrity with ourselves if we extinguish it, because we will no longer be aware of the things that are challenging what matter most to us. It also is not a strategy to help people tolerate unethical situations. That's also been suggested. Or blaming the victim, which is this idea that if you talk about moral resilience, you're putting all the responsibility on the individual. I'm going to come back to this later. But I think we have to begin to unpack what is underneath these claims. And it's also been suggested that it is focused on avoiding doing immoral things. Well, it's not just an individual problem. It's a system problem. All the many systems. And I would also say it's not the only pathway, but I think it's one part of the puzzle to help us find our way back to what matters most. So I want to just pause here and talk a little bit about the research that we've done, just a little teeny bit, so you can get a kind of feel for how this concept has emerged. So we did interviews with clinicians about their definitions of moral resilience, and we came up with these 6 pillars: personal and relational integrity, buoyancy, self-regulation and awareness, moral efficacy, and self-stewardship. So since today our focus is really on leadership, I'm going to highlight all of these, but in particular a few, especially the integrity part. So when you think about integrity, what do you think about? Strength. Okay. So if you look at the word, integrity begins with I for a reason. We have to start with ourselves. And integrity requires us to know what we stand for. Now, that's an important framing, because many times we are clear about what we stand against, but we're not so clear about what we stand for. Why is that important? If we are standing against something, we are already defensive. We are in a fight mode. If we stand for something, for example, I can stand against racism. I can stand for justice. The difference is the energetic shift that happens when you're standing for something. It's a grounding. It is a stake in the ground. And I look at Ellen back here. I know Ellen stands for justice. And you know it because it is visible in how we live our values. We don't just talk about them. We are them. We are curious. We inquire about what will serve, not how we will get our way, but what will actually serve. We have to ask hard questions to be in integrity with ourselves. We have to speak out for what we stand for, with a caveat. Speaking out has to be principled and grounded and not unregulated moral outrage that causes harm to others and to ourselves. Integrity invites us to listen to the call of conscience. Conscience is that signal that tells us there's danger. It starts in our bodies. When you say, my gut tells me this is wrong, it's because your nervous system has detected threat. Your sympathetic system is saying, watch out, danger. But what we also know about conscience is like other systems of threat. If we begin to normalize things and we no longer perceive that twinge of conscience, we will begin to engage in activities that are contrary to our values. So we want to have a robust relationship with our conscience. And not just to say, oh, that's not my problem. We need to inquire, why is this coming up? And what is the response? I am courageous despite risks. Doesn't mean uninformed risk-taking, but rather principled risk-taking. I know and honor my limits. I take principled action or inaction, and I am responsible and accountable. Now that sounds like a really high bar. Integrity is not perfection. Integrity is turning toward the broken parts of ourselves with compassion and starting again. Because if we are expecting perfection, we will all feel that we are failing. And that is really not the purpose of integrity in its fullest sense. Knowing who we are means we need to know and articulate what our values are. And I noticed in some of the materials, and I was really happy to see, the focus on universal values. And the distinction between what we value, which might be a preference, versus a value that can be applied to everyone. So when you think about that list, it's a pretty small list. If you look across all the traditions, things like respect for human dignity, justice in its many forms, compassion. You might add a few others to that list, but if we could uphold those three universal values, imagine the world we would live in. So here are a series of questions for leaders that have to do with integrity. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want you to think about, as a leader, how do my values show up? How do the values I espouse, how are they visible? How do I notice myself demonstrating moral resilience? It's not about asking others to be morally resilient. We have to be morally resilient. How do we notice when our values are being compromised or threatened? Do we know what those signals are in our bodies and our hearts and our minds? How do we notice the compromises in our integrity that we make? Do we ever exercise conscientious objection or refusal? These are the kinds of questions that leaders must examine for ourselves. Otherwise, our words are hollow to those that we are trying to lead. We have to be the embodiment of them. And it requires a kind of moral humility. And we don't have a lot of humility in our world right now. But if you think about moral humility, it is a willingness to explore our beliefs and values for their coherence, their pertinence, and even sometimes to revise or refine them. That's a hard one. And it is also an invitation to let go of our preconceived ideas and be open to new possibilities. It means we have to embrace, I don't know. Hard. It also requires moral courage. And moral courage is the capacity to befriend our fear, to stand up for our values and principles, to act in accordance with them. And it takes the heart that enables us to take risks. And I'm not talking about disproportionate courage to the situation. It is really a discernment process to discern what is the courageous action. In many ways, this is my grandkitty, just so you know. This is Lulu. But notice strong back of equanimity. That's being in alignment with our values. Soft front is a soft front of compassion. That is the leader's most important embodiment. Strong back, soft front. The second part I wanted to highlight is, I mentioned I'd done some work in Japan, and we were using the word integrity, and the translators were saying, we don't have a word in Japanese for integrity, and I was like, okay, well, let me see if I can try and explain it. So a dear friend and colleague, Kaz Tanahashi, is a renowned translator of Japanese text. He's a calligrapher. He has such incredible wisdom on many of these topics. And so I asked Kaz, what is integrity? And what he told me was this: whole oneness. So the idea that our integrity is fundamentally interconnected is a very important aspect of moral resilience. Personal integrity is the prerequisite. We have to know who we are. But the reality is that our integrity is intertwined with the integrity of others. And as professionals, that includes our professional values and commitments. You know, you think about the work we do, it's in teams. It recognizes our shared interdependence and our shared humanity. And it creates a space where no one is left out. It honors our diversity. It is fundamentally inclusive. It involves mutual respect and skillful communication so that everyone feels heard and seen and understood. And it involves empathy. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But if you think about environments where there's flourishing, there is empathy, trust, and curiosity. And that really creates the conditions for wholeness. Often, when we are in integrity with one another, our values, our behaviors are aligned. And that's the space where integrity thrives. So if you think about it in our teams, we really value and respect each other's humanity. We recognize that there is always this dynamic flow between me as an individual and me as a part of a team. And it means that we have to pay attention to those interpersonal dynamics. But it's an important part of creating a space, an environment where everyone's integrity can flourish. It also involves the fact that we are constantly resonating with each other. If you think about it from a neuroscientific point of view, our mirror neurons are constantly resonating, right? And if you think about it in one way, if we are all in integrity, we're going to resonate with that, but we are also going to resonate when we are out of integrity. Have you ever been a part of a group? Things begin to deteriorate, and we all sort of end up in the basement. That kind of resonance is an important part of being able to create a space where integrity can thrive for everyone. And it's important for empathy. Empathy, we have learned, actually is multifaceted. It often involves an affective component where we sense into the feelings of others in response to what messages we're getting from them, that affective part. It also includes a cognitive part, the taking the perspective of another and trying to understand their experience. But we have to be careful with perspective taking because sometimes we're wrong. Perspective taking does not guarantee accuracy, and sometimes we actually can misplace mistaken assumptions about other people or situations. So it's important in our work that we go to the source, ask the person, how should I interpret what just happened? What am I missing? We had a very interesting conversation this week. I do retreats with nurses, and we were talking about this idea of misplaced assumptions and actually being curious and inquiring, what might explain what just happened? I think Parker Palmer's quote here, the human soul does not want to be fixed. It simply wants to be seen and heard. And so when we think about these qualities of moral resilience and leadership, it starts with listening, which includes this reordering of these letters. Silence. Many of us are really uncomfortable with silence, and we do everything we can to fill it up. Listening as a leader, I think if there was one skill, this would be the skill. Listen wholeheartedly to the words of another, not to decide what you're going to say next, but to hold those words as sacred in that moment. When you think about relational integrity in the organization, it is really paying attention to how organizational values align and support the integrity of everyone without disproportionate stress or distress or degraded well-being. This is where the system comes in. And it's always the case that there are going to be power imbalances, that there are going to be constraints that are imposed by those systems. We are dependent on each other to be able to do our jobs, to address the challenges. So one of the questions I think for leaders is what systems, policies, processes uphold the relational integrity of everyone or make it vulnerable or violated? It's paying attention to what's happening in the system. And this is an example. We are in a human energy crisis in our world, and in healthcare in particular. Everyone is hanging on by a thread. And if the systems are contributing to that, we have to make different decisions as leaders so that we are not contributing to that human energy crisis, AKA burnout. So, as a leader, is this an environment that enables people to be their best selves at work? Instead of what's wrong, how about discovering my best self? I had a postdoc who sent me a link for a leadership program she was in. It asked me to describe her at her best. Instead of, oh, you need to take this course and that course, to give someone a blueprint of when I see you at your best, this is what is happening. How do you amplify that? And then let's figure out what the gaps are. So here's some more questions for leaders. What systems, resources do I use as a leader to address ethically challenging situations? Do I shoot from the hip? Or do I have a systematic way of approaching value conflicts in my organization? Do I notice those patterns? Do I have ways of detecting what is degrading the integrity of the people in this organization? Am I aware of the impact of decisions? Are they communicated transparently? Are the reasons for the decisions made clear to people so they can understand, yes, there were trade-offs and we were intentional about how we made them? Do we allow regulatory, legal, financial issues to override our moral compass? Those are the kinds of questions that really help us to be able to create an environment of integrity. Now, here's some enabling factors. The idea of buoyancy, knowing when you're in your resilient zone and what knocks you out of it. And how do you get yourself back into that flow of balance where you can see things clearly? One of those is, where's your mind focused? Anybody on autopilot? Anybody drive here and didn't even notice how you got here? Autopilot. Our minds are constantly dispersed, distracted, and divided. We all believe that we can multitask, but guess what? The brain can only do one thing at a time. So, our mind can be on things that are not even what's happening right here. So, if you think about that, our guru, Lulu, how do we begin to create the neural pathways that support us under stress to be able to be grounded, to be connected to our values? It means we've got to decrease the chatter. We've got to develop the mindfulness muscle to notice that and shift. Notice and shift. And it means we have to pay attention to what's happening in our bodies, because the state of our mind is a reflection of our bodies. If our bodies are locked down, so is our mind. Think about that relationship. Our heart, our emotions, our intentions are important signals to what matters. How we are mindful in terms of how we listen, how we show up. How many times we have said, oh, I'm just fill in the blank. How we show up and comport ourselves matters. It matters in ways that we're not even aware of. How we respond in a mindful way, how we make decisions, how we enact those decisions. And this is the one that I think leaders are often thinking about the people they serve and forget about themselves. Self-stewardship is a reframe on self-care. which has become a billion-dollar capitalistic moneymaker for things that are very superficial. What we're pointing to here is something else. Self-stewardship starts with that knowing of ourselves intimately, knowing what nourishes, what depletes, what it is that we need to be whole, starting first with ourselves. It involves being able to responsibly and mindfully manage our personal resources. This week I did a retreat with nurse leaders and we did a practice on what's on your plate. I bet if you did an exploration of what's on your plate, it would be overflowing. So it's being aware of what we are putting on our plate, why we are putting it on our plate, what is non-negotiable, what could be delegated, and maybe some of it could be let go of. Imagine that. Instead of piling more on, maybe we could say that little practice of we put something in, we have to take something off. Another part of self-stewardship, which I think is often missing from the self-care narrative, is being able to respond to our limits with compassion. Leaders often expect themselves to be able to fix unfixable problems, that we should be able to do whatever is needed and keep going and keep going. We need to extend the same compassion to ourselves as we do to others and to choose actions that are wholesome and healthy. And the other part of that is asking for and receiving support and resources. Leaders have a hard time asking for support. And even when it's offered, I'm fine, I don't need it. But the truth is, to be whole, we need to learn how to receive and to know when we need to ask for help. And I would say that's an act of integrity. So I'm going to end with the words of Viktor Frankl. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing. The last of human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves and our attitude toward it. So when you think about this idea that the system is going to save us, I don't think so. I think we have to save ourselves. And that's why moral resilience for me is one of the resources that we can draw upon. And we've tried to download what we've learned. We have a second edition coming up of our book, but I look forward to your comments and your engagement in this topic. Thank you very much.
I'll ask that our panelists come on up.
I'm Beth Cruz. I am the Assistant Dean for Public Interest at Vanderbilt Law School. And prior to my role there, I practiced as an education attorney in public interest law in the National Public Defender's Office. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. as I worked with clients who are dealing with high levels of poverty and systemic injustice and racism. So I'm really glad to be engaged in this conversation today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ashmeet Oberoi. I'm a faculty in the Department of Human and Organizational Development at Peabody, Vanderbilt. And I primarily do research on immigrant and refugee communities. I'm a community psychologist by training, so I work a lot with students who are community activists and are working in participatory ways with marginalized communities. So I really appreciate the framework you provided today.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Keith Meador. I am a director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Society at the Medical Center, and where I serve as professor of psychiatry and also as professor of ethics and society in the Divinity School. These topics are so important for the work I do with the VA and DoD across the country, equipping chaplains to be part of mental health care teams.
Absolutely. So I really appreciate this framework too. And as I was reading through portions of the book and listening to your talk, thinking from my context in law, a lot of the legal practice world and medicine are predicated on systems of efficiency and profit, right? And so how do we embody this sort of practice when sometimes time and space is not created for us to bring this level of moral leadership, and in fact it comes into conflict with those systems? I'd love to hear you speak on that small topic.
Just that small topic. Well, let's blow it up and start over. I have what you
Oh, you have it, great.
Well, I think this is the reality that we're in, you know, and I think it's easy to get overwhelmed with the enormity of the issue and forget that we can make change in every space that we're in. You know, so I think about relational integrity of, you know, if we are all in the same orientation and we have a problem in front of us, we can shift the way that we respond. I often think that we take over responsibility for fixing problems that are way beyond our scope. And so I find myself often going back to, okay, what part of this is mine? What part can I make a difference in? And can I keep my focus there so that I don't fall into the futility of overwhelm?
Dr. Rushton, as I shared, like I work a lot with students who are, you know, working in communities, especially marginalized communities, and often take on the role of activists, you know, who are standing up or working in the face of systemic inequities. So could you say a little bit more about what role does healing and radical healing plays in keeping up, preserving your moral, resilience, and to keep going when, like you said, they're dealing with problems that are much more, hard to fix?
Yeah. So let me answer it this way. When I was in my doctoral program at Georgetown, I had the privilege of working with Warren Reich, and a theologian. And Warren wrote a very interesting article in the 80s about phases of suffering. And the three phases that he articulated was, the first phase is mute or voiceless suffering. The second is expressive or lament. And the third is transformative. And so there is, I think, embedded in this work, a path of healing. And part of moral repair, I would say, is how do we help people to begin to move from mute suffering, where we often can't even articulate the inchoate feeling of distress that we have. We don't even know where to locate it, or it is so profound that there are no words to express it. And so part of what we do, I think, with students and activists is to try to help them find the voice. The voice is usually quite shrill in the beginning. I'm sure you've noticed. And I think there's a part of, if we can work with that skillfully and help people to be able to find constructive, beneficial ways to use their voice, that it is possible to transform that situation, that experience, into something more like kintsugi, of where we can actually create a space where we can make sense out of things that appear senseless and maybe really are senseless. But I think it really is a process. It's not something you can demand of someone. It's more of an invitation, I think, to begin a process of unpacking and holding whatever comes with compassion rather than judgment, which we got a lot of judgment all around us, right? And there's a part of the lament of expressive suffering that is very loud. It's often very combative. And part of the big pivot I think we're in right now is, how do we help people to speak up with integrity without hurting themselves and others?
Thank you so much. I want to name the significance of having Cynda Rushton with us. When we look in this story of moral distress, moral injury, and moral resilience, I mean, she references Jameson, who I do give credit to for moral distress. And then in the worlds of psychotherapy, et cetera, psychology, psychotherapy, Jonathan Shea and Brett Litz are two pivotal people with moral injury conversation over the last couple of decades that have really, and Cynda Rushton is the person on moral resilience that is really in that, and that's pretty high constellation that I just, in my opinion, and I think she belongs there without equivocation. And so I want to name that and
You're
honor
very
that.
kind.
And and in thinking about that, because I do think that in so many ways, how we think of moral resilience and its potential to mitigate we know that in some ways two people can have the same experience that might be called a potentially morally injurious event and have a very different outcome and expression.
Totally.
And that we have to keep struggling with, and I think try to keep thinking about. But this construct of moral resilience is so important, and the dynamic that you've given us of the individual and the community for fostering that and for building that, I think is crucial for appreciation of that. And I just want to ask you to, and you've alluded to it at times, but it seems so important to me within that dynamic that so frequently people are caught in it. We've seen in the last few years a lot with healthcare workers. One little study that we did looked at that persons that feel less empowered are particularly vulnerable to these outcomes that get called some form of moral injury, et cetera. And that's particularly true, I think, in a variety of settings, but in healthcare settings as well as in the military and in variety. And we see the outcomes of moral injury more pervasively presenting in that group, and in some ways the younger folk in a leadership context, those who are more junior,
Yep.
maybe most vulnerable. Can you give you mentioned moral courage, but when I'm working with a variety of folks on these issues in context, there's always the issue of sort of like, how do we challenge the powers that be that have betrayed us, that have been such purveyors of betrayal? Or how do a variety of the ways we think about and then the issues of whether it's on the transgressive side, when they've felt limited in being able to call that out. How do we empower, how do we negotiate that they're the most vulnerable, but they're also, in some ways with regard to the moral courage, but but their voice is a necessity, isn't
It's
it?
absolutely a necessity. And it's interesting that you frame it this way. I'm a nurse, okay?
And I didn't, I'm not,
No,
I'm
no,
not trying to bring up healthcare
no,
dynamics,
no, no.
but let's be honest, Cynda,
Hey.
doctors and nurses have struggled with for a long time. Right?
No question. And, you know, when I look at what got me here, it was my own experience, my own suffering is, you know, trying to make sense out of, well, this is really a problem. You know, for example, part of what started my own journey was a patient in the pediatric ICU where in the middle of baby dough, this child had a devastating neurologic injury. And the parents said to the team, we don't want to continue mechanical ventilation. It was a devastating neurologic injury that left this child dependent on mechanical ventilation, feeding tube, had no awareness. The team would not honor their request. We took care of this child's physical body for almost a year. The parents stopped visiting. And on nights, we would care for this body. You'd be like, what are we doing? What are we doing? So, you know, you teach what you have to learn. And when I think about that, it's trying to restore the sense of stability that is needed to speak from a place of clarity. So I've been doing since 2016 a program, the Mindful Ethical Practice and Resilience Academy with nurses. Nurses feel powerless, which is why I think the moral distress started in nursing. It's because we didn't have a voice. And having language, if you think about Reich's framework, having language to express that gives you power. And so it is unpacking, you know, what is it that gets in the way of my speaking up? People behave poorly because of fear or lack of skill. So those two things are things that we can address. So what we do in MEPRA is we start with the foundation, mindfulness practice, being able to be good stewards of our own resources, to fortify ourselves as whole people, and then skill building. How do I speak about my concerns? So we teach those skills. We actually do high fidelity simulation where we simulate a high stakes conversation that they need to apply what they've learned, their skills in moral efficacy to name the problem, skills in communication, skills in self-regulation, and we practice. I have to tell you, every single time after the simulation, everybody stands up a little taller. Like, yeah, I got that. So I think there are skills that we can teach people that restore their sense of efficacy. I can do this. But we have to have spaces where we can practice in a safe environment. Because you might be courageous in speaking up, but it might actually be quite harmful, as we've seen.
We have to acknowledge that at some level, don't we?
And I think the more that our collective can stand in solidarity, it reduces the risk of the individual who has the courage to speak. And that's why we have to have environments where we support and create spaces where we can talk about the hard things safely and respectfully, and not have risk that our conversation that we are having here is going to be corrupted or used in a way that is not how it was intended and does not reflect the promise we've made to be in relational integrity with each other.
I thank you so. And then through building that resilience in that way, mitigating the potential for development of that more corrosive moral injury, right?
Right.
Is that reasonable to, that
Yeah.
if we were more intentional about that, then the hope would be that even when these events are quite substantial, that would mitigate the corrosiveness, the corrosive moral injury from developing.
That's our hope, that we shouldn't be waiting until the house burned down. We should be noticing when the smoke is starting to form that we should do something proactively. Now, on that point, in our research, we have found in several studies now in nurses and clinicians and nurse leaders that moral resilience actually is a protective resource in the development of moral injury symptoms. So the higher the scores on moral resilience, the lower moral injury symptoms, which makes sense. We also have found that it is the combination of organizational effectiveness and moral resilience that decreases moral injury symptoms together.
And that's an individual and community dynamic.
So I like to think of moral resilience as a protective resource. It is not going to solve everything, but it can certainly enable people to remember what is already there and what we might give a little oxygen to.
I wanted to pick up on part of your question there, talking about raising the voices of the vulnerable. And you talked about the cost sometimes of speaking out, right? We have to speak out with integrity, but we also have to be careful that it's bounded in some ways.
Yeah.
And so I'm encouraged in the law school, I in my courses talk to students about what are your values? What's your why? Why are you here? And how can you build your practice based on those values, right? But I have to say the first few times I did that, it felt incredibly vulnerable because people did not talk about that when I was in law school, nor when I started practicing law, right? It was sink or swim. So I do feel hopeful with where we're going, for sure. But I'm wondering in that space when people might not yet be in organizations or employment where they've reached that area of safety that you just mentioned, how can they know, how can they discern what is safe to share, how much to speak up, and when they might need to hold that back? And I know that's a very multi-layered question, but I think some of us might be feeling that. I know in past points in my career, I certainly have had to pull a friend aside and say, how much can I really be honest, right? Do I have to be professional, Beth, or do I get to be honest, Beth?
Well, I think
and is there a difference? And should there be a difference, right? Like that's kind of the core of the question. So, yeah.
Well, I feel like I'm in good company because this is a struggle I've had my entire life. Ellen's here. We've known each other for a long time. We've been through some interesting times. I think that some of it probably is a developmental process. I think there's, we learn when we fall down, we get back up and we go, oh, wow, that didn't work out so well. But I do think part of what's been missing in our world is we don't have any shared norms of how we are together anymore. And I think that what I've been doing in my class is starting with very intentionally talking about how we're going to be together here. And that is not something I did 20 years ago, but it is something that feels absolutely essential right now. And to say, in a classroom, for example, how are we going to be together? How will we hold ourselves accountable for creating this space? What is necessary for us to feel safe? Confidentiality is a really big one right now. So the idea of, are we willing to commit to each other that what is shared here stays here, that nothing that is said here will be repeated, written, verbal, or electronically without the permission of the person who spoke it. That always makes everybody go, what? You're violating my freedom. But if we really seriously want to create safe spaces, we have to have some bounded norms for how we are going to be together. And part of learning, as I said, we have to practice, but we also need to develop a practice of discernment. So I'll share something that has helped me, because sometimes I have a lot to say. And this comes from actually a Buddhist practice of, is what I'm about to say true? Is it beneficial? Is it necessary? Is it the right time and place? And the right time and place is the space where I think a lot of times we have to step back and say, will bringing my voice forward right now serve this situation? Or not? Sometimes we don't know. But there's a pause that's necessary before we speak that helps me kind of go, okay, is this the right time and place? Maybe I am a little too upregulated right now to say something in a constructive way. Maybe I need to take a few little breaths before I actually open my mouth to say whatever it was I was going to say. And this is something I think we can teach in our courses to say, okay, you have a point of view. Before you speak, I want you to pause. And I want you to consider those 4 questions. And then decide what needs to be shared. Those are skills that I think we can use. And, we're not going to always do it right. There are going to be times when our amygdala takes over and we're going to say things, maybe not in the most skillful way. But we also have to be a little generous toward ourselves, that part of why we're speaking up is because something really important is at stake here. And I know as a nurse, I have spoken for patients and families that did not feel like they had a voice. I've spoken for students, for my nursing colleagues. And it's an important commitment that we make to others to speak on their behalf when they are not in the conversation, when they cannot speak. But it is a skill that I think we have to really learn.
So it sounds like seeking places of safety, first of all, where we can express those things. And as leaders, it sounds like we're incumbent for creating those spaces within our classrooms and practices, and then exercising discernment. So thank you so much.
Well, and the other thing that you said that I think is really important is it's great to have colleagues. You could say, let me check this out with you first before I say what I was thinking, a thought balloon above my head. I do think that's part of relational integrity, to say, I'm really struggling with what just happened, and I need some help in how might I communicate that.
Thank you. Your response to, well, just kind of help. I was thinking on the lines more in terms of that all of us are like training students who are in the helping professions, right? Being counselors, psychiatrists, nurses, physicians. So the idea of creating safe spaces really translates well to our classrooms. Mm-hmm. What other specific strategies would you recommend for us to practice, let's say, in our mentoring of students, in our program, in our programmatic spaces? Like we are like in the higher ed basically too, so that students can develop. We create a space for students to develop these skills of moral resiliency.
Mm-hmm. So this is just one example. And it has to do with developing both skills in what I would say moral efficacy, being able to name what the ethical problems are and being able to reason and think about them. So in my course, we do debates. And we pick edgy topics that I ask the students to prepare both sides to. And the reason is we often have some real biases about which side of that question I want to answer. So how we've worked with that is they have to prepare both sides because they don't know until they come to class which side they're going to debate. So if you are interested in getting a great grade, you're going to have to invest as much time in the alternative than you did in the one that you are really sure about. What has been fantastic about this is inevitably, after they've done their debate, and some of them have to debate the side they didn't believe, we do a debrief. What was that like for you? What came up as you were debating this other side? Almost always what happens is they will say, I probably didn't change my point of view, but I absolutely understand that there are good reasons on the other side that I hadn't appreciated before. And that has been really, it's not telling somebody, they're discovering it themselves. They're like, oh, well, I had to go research that other side. I didn't really like it at all, and I was really the whole time. But I came up with some reasons. And now I have a different sort of appreciation for maybe what might be the reasons the other person is thinking the way they are. It also gives them an opportunity to say, okay, now I understand a little bit more about what that argument is, so I can be better prepared to respond to it in a way that's not reactive. So that's just one example. It's practicing, being in these spaces.
That's a great strategy to counter confirmation bias.
Yes.
Because what we're seeing, we're increasingly living in our echo chambers, consuming the same
Yes.
information that confirms what our perspectives, our beliefs. That I really appreciate that suggestion.
Yeah, it's fun too.
I'm going to pivot on you a little bit.
Okay.
You've been so thoughtful in some of the engaging, the practical examples, et cetera, with us. But you mentioned norms, and you mentioned development, both of which I think they're real. They're real. What does Professor Rushton think about moral formation?
Oh, absolutely.
How does it occur? How does it occur, Cynda? What was involved in us becoming discerning, thoughtful, able to examine both sides? But what's more information, and what are the components, and how does it happen, Cynda?
Well, I wish I had the big answer to that one. I could tell you.
Just want Dr. Rushton's perspective.
Well, I think, I do think it's a developmental process. I mean, it begins early in life, right? In our own home environments is where it begins. And it also, it happens in our educational environments.
We have to be somewhat hopeful that it can still be reconfigured, right?
Well, I mean, if you think about integrity also requires an ongoing, engagement in our own process, to step back and say, I don't know about other people here, but, I grew up in one framework, and I realized at a certain point it didn't really work well for me. It wasn't aligned with who I am and what I stand for. And so there are stages, I think, of that formation. And there are events that have significant impact on that process. If you think about big events that have happened in our world, there's a lot of them. I'm going to be interested to see what the long tail of COVID means for young people who were born and growing up during COVID. What will their formation look like? What are the messages, internal and external, that have been communicated? And how does that impact the way we see the world? Our worldview can be small, it can be expansive, it can be, sort of framed by lots of values and beliefs that we don't even realize we're taking on. I know that was true for me. You know, I grew up in a pretty strictly rigid framework. And then I realized, wow, there's a lot more out here than that. And, you know, if we have opportunities, for example, for me, being able to be outside of our country, to see the realities of other cultures, countries, gives a whole different perspective on the gifts we have here. And if you don't ever look beyond your immediate environment, it's likely that your worldview is going to be quite constrained. And so, you know, I think there are lots of ways through education, and I know higher ed is kind of under siege at the moment in terms of how we are engaging in that process. But I think it is a time where we have to really pause and take stock of how do we create an environment of inclusion, but how do we also begin to teach people what you're talking about? Some of those skills for how we can respectfully be with each other without the kind of hate, without destruction in the process.
While acknowledging that there are distinctive
There are.
commitments
Absolutely.
and values that we would have. And it's a complex process, but
I
didn't
think
mean to
that,
cheat on you, but I just wanted to ask you.
no, I don't
think
have
it's
the
good.
answer, but I think we all have a responsibility to be part of it.
Thank you.
So now I'd like to open it to the floor for questions. We have about 15 minutes left. So if anybody has a question, go ahead and raise your hand and I will bring the mic to you. All right. Please introduce yourself as well.
Hey, my name is Graham Dennis. I'm a first-year MDiv in the Divinity School. And first, I just wanted to mention that idea of preparing both sides of an argument is so powerful. Like, I'll be reflecting on that for a while, and just as a way specifically to move a student out of dualistic thinking. That's amazing. My real question is, I saw you're involved, Dr. Rushton, thank you for being here. I saw you're involved with the Schwartz Center and Schwartz rounds. Is that right?
Tangentially, I would say.
Tangentially? Well, so my question was just going to be, what is the intersection of this kind of work and maybe just to put it more generally, you know, the intersection of this kind of work and direct contact with carers, you know, in the course of doing their jobs? That makes sense.
So that's a great question. Schwartz Rounds is an example of a kind of framework that creates safe spaces to talk about hard things. I actually spend a lot of time with clinicians who are struggling with hard questions. Part of the reason that I have continued my ethics consultation work now for a long, long time is because they're so, I really like to be in the muck. To be honest, I kind of gravitate toward the hard things. And there's a great opportunity because when you get called for a situation where people are struggling, it's an opportunity to ask different questions. It's an opportunity to acknowledge this is really, really hard. And it's not because you're not smart. It's not because you haven't tried hard enough. It's because it's a hard problem to solve, and there are no good answers. And to be able to step back and say, I want you to notice how much you care about trying to fix this situation and how much effort you've put forth. And everybody goes, oh. Nobody noticed that they were trying because they cared. all they could see is the problem. And there are some problems that actually cannot be solved. And being able to help people say, okay, like I was saying to you, how do you put some boundaries around what part of this are you responsible for? How much effort is required to be in integrity with yourself and others? It is not a requirement of integrity to decimate yourself in the process. It is a requirement to attempt, to take action, to recognize the problem, to do something. But there are also limits to that. And so it's trying to help people, work with how much is required. And when can I put this expectation of myself down and say, I have done the best I can in this circumstance, with these facts. And I have to let go of expecting myself to fix an unfixable problem.
Just an addendum to that, for what it's worth, here at Vanderbilt in the Medical Center, we call that bedside matters, and those occur monthly. Because those are, what a wonderful space you just described.
I don't mind speaking up either. I've got a pretty loud voice. Hi, my name is Olivia Hobbs. I work at the medical center, but I'm also a master's student in the School of Nursing and an incoming Cal Turner Fellow. So my question kind of goes back to creating these safe spaces. I really appreciate that you guys are mentioning this, but I guess kind of a step further than that, how do we create these spaces, but most importantly, make them accessible to everybody and empower them to bring their voice to the table? Because I think that's the hardest part, is making sure that everybody has the availability of it, especially in talking about the academia world. Not everybody has the privilege for higher education, and so how are we making these accessible to everybody and empowering them to come forward to the table?
Well, I can answer, but I bet there's some folks right here that could answer too. Do you want to take a crack at that?
What comes to mind for me is in practice, thank you. In practice, making the space accessible was about really recognizing the autonomy and dignity of my client and making sure that what they wanted was clearly heard and drove the case entirely, right? My job was to come alongside, give them my expertise and opinion, but really let that person move the case along. And so I think about it in terms of the people we're caring for, the students we're teaching. If we're in a position of authority, I think we just have to look for those ways to make sure those voices are not only heard but are central. So the thing I flashed to is practice and really thinking about, it's easy as lawyers. The first time you do a case, you go through and sit with a client, you're running through almost like a law school exam, all the legal violations that happen. I wonder if this happens to physicians too, or nurses. You're thinking about all the problems, but that's not why we're there. It's really to care for this person as a whole and use the tools we have to elevate their voice. So I wonder if that's maybe a little profession specific, but it is about who's in front of me and how do I make sure they're feeling heard and valued. And then also just tie that to part of the wellness piece is sometimes we have to calibrate the definition of success based on the case, right? So sometimes we would say a win in this case is going to the school board and making sure that they pay for all the violations. But more often than not, what a win really was standing in solidarity with somebody who in juvenile court or at the school system was going through one of the worst days of their life, right? Or to, I have a colleague who used to say, well, our job is to be a speed bump on the road to injustice. And sometimes that's all we could do, right? Like slow down the injustice, minimize harm. So maybe that's a little bit more than you asked, but for me it really was about focusing who was in front of me and making sure they were fully heard and their autonomy was protected. And I felt like that impacted my sense of autonomy as well. And I know you talk about this in the work too, that our autonomy is a critical part of feeling well. So yeah, that's how I would answer it. Others have responses?
Take that. So one of the things we do in our line of work is we work in participatory ways with communities. So there's a whole line of research called community-based participatory research, CBPR, exactly. So it's about very, being cognizant of the power dynamics in the community and also the power dynamics between you and the community and you as a representative of a certain institution. And then it's all about, once you're aware of that, what are you doing to kind of break down, to kind of level those power hierarchies? And how you conduct yourself, like, asking the community what the research question they would like to be, it's not my research question, right? I'm coming here with my research agenda, but what is it you would like to be researched, right? And also we approach communities with what we call as a deficit perspective, like this is what is wrong in your community, and I'm going to come and fix it with my research dollars and funding. But can we go and ask communities, can we do what we call a strength-based research? And Eve Tuck, phenomenal Indigenous scholar, talks about doing desire-based research with communities, right? Like, what are the existing resources in the communities, and what are your desires? Right, using your existing resources, how can we, what are the aspirations? And not just what are the problems, but what are the aspirations in this community? So I feel like when you approach, it's the conduct, the way you engage will create settings where people will feel safe enough to voice what is it, the desire, what are their hopes for, what their goals are, what are their objectives. I don't think we can empower people, but we can create settings where they feel empowered. It's just a slight different. It's more about the settings where they intrinsically feel empowered and would not be afraid to show up, yeah.
Just a very quick example to go along with that in some ways. A healthcare ethics course that we teach each fall in the center that is literally kind of half medical students and half divinity school students, and then a few other graduate students from around the campus, et cetera. And so one of the things in this sort of example that you were alluding to before, of setting the parameters in the course of we're going to be peaceable. We're going to, but we are going, it's a seminar course, so we're going to have to be, there's a certain vulnerability, and we start out with making sure everyone tells their story. Everyone has a chance to tell their story. But the core point I was wanting to make, but as you can imagine, if it's divinity school students and medical students, they have a different language, a very different language when they're thinking about ethics. And so one of the points we always emphasize, and I think it's crucial in that sort of setting the frame, is saying, your language is good language. It's not like your language is lesser because it's different than the others, but you're going to need to help interpret. One of the crucial parts you can do is trying to encourage them to feel like your language is important, but you're going to have to help interpret that and give some insight for your colleagues here if we're going to have a real community develop that can have the kind of tough conversations that have to happen, in my opinion, in a healthcare ethics course. So just to...
I'm Ellen Clayton. I'm also in the center, and I just have a couple quick comments. One is that I want to endorse Cynda's comment early on that you need to that it's good to advise people to be careful about when they're going to be focal and when they're not. That is a lesson hard learned, but it is a good lesson. The other thing that I would just observe is I've been at Vanderbilt for 36 years, and I am feeling more sense from the students of needing to feel safe than I have ever felt before. I taught reproductive justice last semester in the law school, and my students were just so thankful to have a safe space to talk about this, that it was startling, actually. So I just thought I would say that. Much more need for safety than I've ever seen before.
I would 100% agree, Ellen. It's a very hard time now to figure out how can we actually engage with one another with the intention of learning and actually honoring each other's experience. And it's hard, but I think we need to continue to try to be intentional and mindful about what does that look like. How do we make it the norm rather than the exception of being in Ellen's class? We need to think about how we do that everywhere. And it's no small thing. But I think the more that we are able to do that and create spaces where voices who wouldn't necessarily be heard can be heard, can be understood. And I loved what you said about a strengths-based approach. You know, if we're constantly looking for the problems, we are overlooking the power that is already there. And that's in many ways why our work in moral resilience has really been a shift in thinking you're not failing because you haven't solved this problem. It's not because you're weak. It's not because you're not smart enough. It's because the problems are so complex, they are so enormous, that we have to recalibrate our expectations of ourselves and to think about what does integrity require of us, and how can we begin to engage in that conversation in a different way so that we are not degrading ourselves in the process, because we are all scarce resources. And we need everybody to right the boat here.
All right, one last question.
We'll have our all-star clinical nurse specialist in the medical center, Cynda. So.
I'm Jess. I'm a clinical nurse specialist in the CVICU in the medical center. And this is the second opportunity I've had to listen to you speak, and it just really speaks to my soul and my passion in nursing. And what I notice is that there's a huge disparity in the investment in nurses when it comes to understanding this language and giving them the tools to examine their own values as they relate to the care that they're offering their patients. We spend so much time, focusing on skills and developing workflows and process improvement. But the work that you're talking about and the work that Dr. Meador does with, the School of Medicine and the School of Divinity, it doesn't translate over into those that are doing the frontline work immediately out of their, primary education. And I'm curious how you anticipate us making a shift in that and what we can do now in our current work environment.
Well, I'm passing the baton to you. I have been pushing I have been pushing this rock up the hill for a long time. So, yes, I think we have to use for example, our pre-licensure programs, we have competencies. And there's a tendency to meet the competency in a way that is quite tactical. And I think we have to really ask ourselves, is that sufficient? Because I don't think it is. And I think, so for example, we have in our state, we are very fortunate, we have had funding for the last 4 years for the Resilient Nurses Initiative, where we partnered with faculty in schools of nursing to integrate resilience and ethical practice from the first day of nursing school. We also partner with our 44-member Nurse Residency Collaborative, and we have worked with them. We've developed 38 modules on topics related to integrity, values, and resilience to support faculty to integrate this content into existing courses. Because, as we all know, there's a lot of competition for space in the curriculum. And so instead of trying to advocate for more space, we have taken the approach, create space within what you're already doing. Here's some resources that will help you to do that. That's the beginning part. But what we know is when you get into practice in that NRP program, we need to have more and more efforts to practice these skills in the same proportion as technical skills. So we're working with Vizient, who creates the NRP curriculum. We are partnering with them with our resources. But I also think it has to go further than that. So our MEPRA program, our Mindful Ethical Practice and Resilience Academy, we have partnered academic practice partnerships to create this ongoing professional development that is continuing to deepen these skills, so that we have nurses who do have that vocabulary, they have the confidence, they know how to recognize these issues, they know how to speak up about them, and they can be part of creating that unit-based environment where the expectation is we are not going to remain silent. We will bring the issues up. We will do so in a respectful way. And we have created that environment of support for people to be able to do that. So yes, and it's going to take some real intention and investment to be able to get there. And I am worried right now that we are sort of, again, in another phase of saying, oh, that ethics stuff is optional. We need it now more than ever as core. And unless we insist upon it, we are going to, sort of take the autopilot way. And I don't think the outcomes are going to be what we want.
All right. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Dr. Cynda Rushton and our respondents. For those of you online, you are invited to Owen for lunch at noon, the Owen School of Business Management, if you are in town. See you there.